is to love ourselves. We have so many layers in our lives that have stopped us from loving ourselves. And not just the rhetoric that comes from the outside that we absorb in our own lives, but I think that there are so many of us who self-doubt ourselves. There are so many of us who self-judge ourselves. You know, we have this layer of judgment from outside, but I tell you, sometimes that judgment's nothing compared to the judgment that we make on ourselves. You know, I think that just reinforces the judgment, but we are so critical sometimes of ourselves. There is so much self-hatred that goes on in our own world and in our own lives. So much that is within us that, quite honestly, this practice of Christianity, this knowing God in our lives, is a lifelong experience that should take us initially to a place of self-love, to cast out all of the fears that are within us. And that is not an easy job, sisters and brothers. You know, I think that sometimes our theology has taught us that it's okay to accept the love of God, but what about accepting the love of our own selves? The love that we can truly have for self. Now, we've been told that that's selfish. That if you really love yourself too much, then your ego has really got in the way. But the letter of John tells us that in order for us to really fully love God, we must first love and accept ourselves just as we are. Good, bad, and the ugly. Every single bit of ourselves needs to be incorporated into our body, into our soul, because what John says in this letter is that what we see in ourselves is God. I mean, that was really out there for the time when John was writing this letter, that this notion that this God that we believe in is not a God who's out here anymore, but is a God who is within us. And that if that God is within us, then we should allow that God to absorb every single bit of us. Now, let's just take that one step further. Because if we really allow that God to absorb every single piece of us, then what that means is that we are God incarnate. We are God in the world today. We are the God made flesh today. You know, now, a few weeks' time, we're going to be celebrating Jesus, who was God made flesh. But the reality is that the legacy of Jesus is that we became God made flesh in the world today. We talk about being the hands and the feet and the heart and the mouth of Jesus. But, you know, that's not just, they're just not the essential organs of Jesus or of God in this world. Every single bit of us is a piece of the God that we are connected to as sisters and brothers of the living God. Every single bit of us. And what that means ultimately is that this love of self is not about ego. This love of self is about letting go of ego. Letting go of everything that we would want to portray into the world that is about us. And allow just the presence of God to feed through us. That's the epiphany that I think this letter strikes at. And I think this is the epiphany that John drives home for us today. That the reality is that to really know self-love means that we need to allow our egos to be moved out of the way so that we can be totally absorbed by the presence of God. Yeah. Let ego out of the way. You know, they always say a preacher has to have a pretty big ego to be able to get up and speak every Sunday morning. But I want to tell you, this is the most nerve-wracking moment of my week. Getting up every Sunday morning and having to speak to a group of people. Now, I know that there are some people who completely feed on that. But I see three other reverends in the room this morning. And they're all nodding at me this morning. It's a wonderful, gratifying experience. Thank you. Keep moving it this way. But the reality is that getting up every Sunday and knowing that people are expecting something from you is the most nerve-wracking experience. I can't eat on a Sunday morning. Before I come to work, before I come to church, I can't eat. My stomach is just turning upside down. It's that fear of getting up and suddenly there'll be nothing to speak. Now, I don't have the fear, well, actually I do have the fear that one day I'll get up and there'll be no one to speak to. But, you know, so I'm always grateful that there are people here on a Sunday morning. But, you know, that whole sense of fear, of knowing that that God is calling me, and using each and every one of us to speak God's truth, God's word. It's almost barely enough for me to keep a cup of coffee down on a Sunday morning. I start as soon as I wake up, my stomach starts turning, everything starts moving in my body as I'm trying to divest myself of ego and allow God to speak through me. Allow God to have the present, to let God have the word. Because I truly believe that if we allow that to happen, then God's love moves through us more freely. We're sometimes so concerned of making sure that people know that we love them, that we like it, people. But the truth of the matter is that if love is truly a part of our lives, if God is truly absorbing every piece of our lives, then whenever we reach out with love, it's not our love. It's God's love that we're reaching out with. It's God's presence. And God's love is unconditional. God's love is not one that's filled with judgment, but God's love is one that's filled with compassion and with forgiveness and with that assurance that even if I might not agree with something you're doing in your life, it's not about me. It's about being with one another in the times of goodness and in the times of hardship, but rather allowing our lives to be present for one another. Oh, believe me, there are plenty of things that people have done to me, and I'm sure people have done to you, that would stop you being present with people. But when you allow ego to move out of the way, when you allow your prejudices to move out of the way, and just try to be the presence of God in this world, there is something that translates to another human spirit that enables people to have a second chance, or a third chance, or a fourth chance. Now, I'm not saying that we don't have to put boundaries in our lives. Sometimes those boundaries are really, really healthy for us. But if we're truly moving in spirit, if we're truly moving in God's love, then we should not be invested in the outcome of what somebody else does or somebody else chooses. All we should be vested in is how can we be present with one another with that perfect love that casts out all fear.